The Department of Justice is investigating Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook over allegations of fraud related to her mortgages. A letter signed by DOJ attorney Ed Martin also urging Fed Chair Jerome Powell to remove Cook from the central bank's board, though, in fact, he doesn't have the power to do that. Joining us right now to help us understand the allegations against Cook, some of the rules, and how this could all play itself out. Former Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Kanter, he's a CNBC contributor, a distinguished law professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And you have a beautiful shot of Washington right behind you, my friend. It's nice to see you this morning. Help us understand. I just want to know, when you first heard this news, did you immediately say this is a terrible crime? Did you say there's something else going on? Did you think about weaponization? What was going on in your head?
Yeah, the first thing that jumped out to me, Andrew, is that this is not something that the Department of Justice would normally investigate. There's a difference between the court of law and the court of public opinion. In the court of law, this is small ball and very difficult to prove. You'd have to establish not only that she filled out the form incorrectly, but she had the specific intent to deceive, to defraud banks, as opposed to just making a mistake. And so it's not something ordinarily the Department of Justice would investigate and use its scarce resources to address. Now, that's separate from the question of public opinion. People might feel that this makes her unfit for the job, but that's usually something that comes up in the context of a confirmation hearing or, again, a question about whether she's fit for the public trust.
Jonathan, but let's separate then, because I think there's a couple of things going on. Let's separate the legality issue from the prosecution of this issue from how this might have all started. We'll separate them as separate issues. On the legal issue alone, you do agree or believe that it's illegal to lie on your application. And I know you said that it's hard to prove, but I would imagine typically in this kind of context, unless there's a reasonable excuse for it, that the reason you would be saying that you have two primary homes at the same time is because you want the lower rate, and you would know that that's wrong.
Right. So there's really a question about whether there is a technical legal violation and whether somebody engaged in criminal fraud. So to establish criminal fraud, you would have to establish beyond a reasonable doubt not only that she did something that was incorrect, but she had the intent to commit a crime. It's a very high standard, and appropriately so. It means that we're not going to take away someone's liberty rights unless they're really a criminal.
Hey, Jonathan, can I follow up on this, though? Because I've spent a lot of time trying to think this through. I've got multiple mortgages. It would never occur to me to say that one of these other houses was my primary residence because, first of all, I wouldn't think that the lenders wouldn't figure that out anyway, but it's wrong. And the reason that there are higher mortgage rates on second or third mortgages is because you are much more likely to walk away from that and leave the bank holding the bag. So it doesn't feel like it's a victimless crime any more than insurance fraud feels like a victimless crime. Insurance fraud causes everybody else's rates to go up. Mortgage fraud causes everybody else's rates to go up because the banks have to realize that there's going to be a certain amount of failure that comes through on this. The circumstances are strange, and I've tried to think through. I know there are some cases where a mortgage lender will say, yeah, it's okay for you to do that if you were buying a property for an elderly relative or for a disabled child, or if you really had job circumstances where you were going back and forth. I don't know all the facts on this, but what what Bill Pulte has put out suggests that she put one of those properties, she did these within a couple of weeks of each other, and then soon afterward put one of those properties up on the rental market. I would anticipate that someone who's sitting on the Federal Reserve Board would understand what a primary residence is. And you're right. I don't know how they got about. You may look askance at how any of this came out. You may not. You may doubt the whistleblower accusations on some of these things. You may think it was an active investigation. But as Andrew said, let's separate the two. It doesn't seem to me, and it may be widespread, there may be 22,000 cases of this, but it doesn't seem to me like a victimless crime, and it is something that we should crack down on.
Yeah, and to be clear, Becky, I don't necessarily disagree with the underlying premise of what you're saying, which is that if you defraud the bank, it is and can be and should be a crime. The question, I guess, that I'm trying to address is realistically what has to go into proving that in order to established beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody violated the Title 18 and should be subjected to prison or such fines or large fines. And as a practical matter, it's not something typically the DOJ would investigate because there's a lot of this stuff. Whether they could, they certainly could if they wanted to, and they could certainly bring a case. Just in my experience, it's not the easiest kind of case to prove in the absence of a broader evidence of ongoing fraud.
And so, ask us a separate question, unrelated to the politics of it. Do you think that somebody's role in society changes whether they should be prosecuted or not? So you might say, okay, typically we don't go after these things. But in this instance, if you were on the board of the Fed or the CEO of a bank and you were doing this, part of what I imagine, and you and I have actually talked about, you used the word deterrence many years ago. I remember we talked about the word deterrence. Do you say to yourself, okay, well, we don't normally go after this, but this is putting the politics of it aside, a high-value target from a deterrence perspective?
Yeah, there's a question of what should be the case and what is the case. I mean, we can look back and you can look at Martha Stewart and a whole bunch of other, notable prosecutions where you might shrug your shoulders and wonder why the government used its resources for something that might not have been victimless, but relatively insignificant in the grand scheme of the problems that we suffer throughout the world and the kind of crime that goes on a daily basis. As a legal matter, as a technical legal matter, that information about in a criminal case would be prejudicial. It's probably not, unless it related to her job. It's not likely a court would allow evidence of somebody's position to come in, especially in this case if the conduct occurred before she was on the Board of Governors. It's kind of like a stoplight. It doesn't matter if you're in a yellow Ferrari or a champagne Corolla. You still have to stop at the stoplight. The law applies equally to everybody.
Right.
It reminds me of, remember all the government officials who got chased out because they were hiring nannies under the table and not paying them on the books? You can go back, that was probably 15, 20 years ago, but there were a series of them who had done things that were pretty commonplace among other people. But if you are a public official, you're going to be held to a higher standard.
Yeah, Becky, so this is why I think it's important to distinguish between the court of law and the court of public opinion. These kinds of things do come up quite frequently in confirmation hearings to determine whether somebody is fit to hold office. That's usually the proper place to have this conversation, including the one we're having right now, right?
Although if we find out somebody lied about their resume after the fact, they've gotten chased out for that too.
They have, but again, the question is, how are we going to enforce that fairly across the entire federal government, or are we just going to use it when we disagree with somebody over a particular policy question?
So, Jonathan, the next sort of political piece is, look, there are some people, Democrats, you're a Democrat, who look at this and say, this is a weaponization of the government. We don't know exactly how this allegation first emerged. I believe that Pulte suggested that it came from a tip. Who is the tippee? Is that somebody inside? Is that somebody outside? Is it Pulte himself? I mean, right? Like, these are the other questions that have emerged, which then raise questions about sort of how this government is using its authorities. How do you think about that? If you could somehow take any of your politics out of it.
Yeah, so I had a very powerful position in the government where I would be able to bring cases, sign indictments that would effectively take away people's liberty rights. When you're in that position, it's an awesome responsibility, and the power that you have is incredible and can have significant effect on people. You have to use it without fear or favor. And so as much as you might want or have instincts to be political about it, when you're talking about criminal prosecution, you have an obligation as a prosecutor really to look at things in very neutral terms and make sure that you are giving people their due process and using the great force of the United States government and the court system appropriately for the right reasons, which is to enforce the law. Again, I'm not taking a position on whether they should or shouldn't hear. It does raise questions about whether somebody is being singled out simply because you don't like their policy positions. If that is the case, then that is an abuse of power in and of itself, and is something that raises huge questions about its appropriateness.
And what is your sense in this context? Do you have an early take?
Well, again, you really don't want to prejudge these things. The context here raises questions about, again, whether somebody's being singled out because of their policy positions. If that is the case, and I take no position, I don't know whether it is or isn't, then it's a problematic. But taking Pulte for his word, if it's simply an ordinary referral, that's fine. But the Justice Department has an obligation to make sure that it's using its responsibility and its prosecutorial discretion and authority appropriately, not simply in retaliation for a policy position.